your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. From Answer Media, this is the Atheist Manifesto. I'm your host, Callie Wright. Ari and I spent this past weekend in Nashville at the Nashville Nones Convention, and it was awesome. This was the con where 2 years ago, they put the whole thing together in a span of like 6 weeks. They had over 300 people showed up, and they just pulled the whole thing off better than I think even the most optimistic people would have expected. These are some seriously passionate, hardworking people in Nashville that put this whole thing together. This year, I had the pleasure of facilitating 3 separate LGBT discussion panels and gave probably the most deeply personal and emotional talk I've given since I've started doing this whole thing. I tried to capture audio from the panel discussions, but it just didn't turn out well enough to include in the show here. I tried all my audio wizardry and it just didn't work out. And I'm kind of bummed because they're great discussions, but I don't want to insult your ears by making you sift through all of that to get to the good stuff. So this week will be a shorter episode. I'm going to play for you the audio of my talk from the main stage of NanoCon 2017. The title of the talk is Why Atheists Should Be the Best Allies. There's actually kind of a backstory behind this talk ending up the way that it did. I've kind of been on this storytelling kick lately. I didn't want to just throw out the discussion points and the talking points. I actually want to connect using stories. So a few months back, I actually had a completely different talk written. I had some good bullet points on why atheists should be better allies, and it was a respectable talk, I thought. Then Scott Smith from the Recovering from Religion podcast asked for stories of living with religious family members. I figured I could write something pretty meaningful and powerful about my relationship with my grandma. So I got about halfway through writing this piece for the podcast, and I realized I was telling a story that made my point about allyship far better than any discussion point or argument point ever could. So I decided this was going to be my talk. It's the most real, raw, and intensely personal story I've ever shared in front of a crowd. So here it is, from the main stage of NanoCon 2017, Why Atheists Should Be the Best Allies. I'm going to talk to you today about one of my least favorite questions in the world. And that question is, what does any of this have to do with atheism? So if there's a post on social media or on Pathos or on YouTube that's not something like, let's jerk each other off over how stupid Pascal's wager is for the 5,000th time, these people come out of the woodwork, right? If you're a person who's a person or an organization that's primarily known for your atheism, you step outside of that, and these people just, they come out of nowhere. What does any of this have to do with atheism? So, I'm going to talk to you today about why that question infuriates me. My grandma was my best friend. She even told me once, and very quietly, that I was her favorite grandkid, because I was the only one of her grandkids that ever took time to spend time with her when I didn't have to. I always wanted to hang out with my grandma. She had all the cool movies. She had all the best food. We watched that Disney Robin Hood movie, the one with the fox and the animals, so cute. We watched it over and over and over again. And she had the best food too. You know, as a kid, potatoes were my thing. You can tell by my size. She had a real deep fryer and this thing that would cut potatoes into curly fries. And as a kid, like, that's the coolest thing ever. And we also went to church together. I refused to go to kids' church because I wanted to stick around my grandma. And I was also way more interested in what the adult pastor had to say than what the youth pastor had to say. He was so much more emotional and expressive. Like, this guy was passionate. He would fall to his knees begging people, please don't go to hell. I don't want anybody to go to hell. And like, honestly, I believed him too. I believed what my grandma taught me about religion and what God wanted from his people.
As a 12 or 13-year-old kid, I obviously didn't have a super sophisticated understanding of religion, but on a basic level, I knew what sin was, I knew that unrepentant sinners went to hell, and most of all, I knew that Grandma was going to heaven, and I wanted to make sure I was there with her. She'd spend hours talking about what heaven would be like. I'd get to see my grandpa there. I'd get to meet aunts and uncles and great-grandparents I never knew. I was stoked about heaven. I remember when I was old enough to understand what death was, I asked my grandma one of the realest questions I'd ever asked an adult as a kid. I looked up at my grandma and I said, "Grandma, when you die, will you please come back to haunt me so I don't have to miss you until I get to heaven?" And she knelt down and she pulled me in really tight and held my head to her chest and she said, "Sweetie, it doesn't work that way. When Grandma dies, you'll just have all the sweet memories of her to hold you over until we see each other again." And it wasn't too long after that when I realized it was all bullshit. So the TLDR version is that I started looking into Christianity, figured out it didn't make much sense, and I told my grandma about my doubts, and she was concerned, of course. She asked if I'd agree to meet with her pastor. I was asking questions that she couldn't answer, and she figured that he was the guy to go to answer those questions for me. And I'm not even sure I remember specifically what my questions were, but I'm pretty sure it had to do with, the ways the Bible contradicts itself. And her pastor was not a good apologist. His answers basically boiled down to this: it's not wrong to question. God gave us a curious mind, and that's a wonderful thing to have. You should explore your curiosity and ask questions, but you need to know that all the answers are in the Bible. And if I remember right, I was 15 or 16 at the time. None of what he said sat right with me at all. Like, if this is all really true, shouldn't you be able to look anywhere and see confirmation of what's in the Bible? And so, long story short, I decided that Christianity didn't make any sense at all. I'd heard some cool things about Wicca. Nature was cool. The idea of being able to cast spells was cool. And, of course, it scared and pissed off the adults. And, of course, looking back, I think that was probably the most appealing part of it. My grandma caught me reading a book about Wicca, and you might have thought I murdered a child. She was terrified. Now, the thing to know about my grandma is that she was very much a product of the Satanic Panic era. She believed in rock music being inherently satanic, and hidden messages and mind control embedded in music and TV shows, and all those other paranoid things that you hear Christians say sometimes. She'd already been really concerned about my music taste, so this was all very, very unwelcome news. And I lost interest in Wicca after a few months, and then after one very brief rekindling of my Christian faith, I was left with atheism. I think I actually used the word to describe myself. I was 16, 17, somewhere in that neighborhood. I'd done a lot of reading, spent some time with friends who didn't believe in God, and that's just kind of where I ended up. And by then, as a teenager, I didn't spend quite as much time as I used to with my grandma. I had band things happening, I had girls to chase and shows to go to, but we were still close. One day I was at her house and we were talking, and she asked me where I stood with the Lord. And I was kind of dreading this conversation. I knew it was going to happen, and I knew she wasn't going to be happy with my answer. So even though I was scared, I was honest with her. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, Grandma, I just don't think that any of it is true anymore. And I was surprised, but she didn't freak out like I thought she would. She was concerned, of course. She wasn't excited, but it didn't turn into the fight that I thought it was going to, thankfully. She was always willing to admit when she didn't have a good answer for my questions, but her faith was enough for her. She grew up in an abusive household. Church was her only escape from that. So on a level, it makes sense that her faith is such a comfortable place for her. It makes sense that she would hold so tightly to it, even when confronted with questions that she couldn't answer. The thing that I always respected about her, though, was that her faith never seemed to take precedence over her relationship with me. We'd argue sometimes, and sometimes it'd get heated, but we'd eventually come back around to just talking about life, and we'd laugh, and she'd cook me dinner, and we'd watch TV together. It's what we did. And I was really, really happy that we could still be close, even after I came out as atheist. Then I came out as trans. Now, my grandma was the single person in my life that I was ready to lose a relationship with after I came out. I'd heard the way that she talked about queer and trans people, and there were so many times before coming out I just wanted to scream in her face, You're talking about me right now. And I wanted to tell her how badly those things hurt, but I was scared, so I kept my mouth shut. But eventually I had to come out. I didn't have a choice. It would have killed me otherwise. And I absolutely dreaded coming out to her. So I went to her house, I sat down, and I didn't know what to say, so I just came out with it. I'm transgender. And she didn't realize what it meant at first, so I had to do some explaining very nervously. And I was waiting for the light bulb moment. I was waiting for her to realize what I was telling her and for her to just lose it completely. But she didn't. And she finally sort of understood what I was trying to tell her. And I was crying really hard at this point. And I struggled through my tears to tell her I was afraid that our relationship was going to end because of who I was. And she calmly assured me that that wasn't the case. I love you no matter what. You're my grandchild. I helped raise you. I love you. And those words just hung in the air for a second. I felt a 10-ton weight lift off of me. And then she finished her sentence. But you know how I feel about that sort of thing. It's just not biblical. And I was so happy that our relationship didn't end then and there, that the weight of that last sentence didn't really hit me right away. I mean, honestly, what else could I expect? Honestly, I left that meeting thinking this went the best that it probably could have. And when I got home from her house, I was eating dinner and she called me. And I was eating, so I didn't answer the phone right away. She left me a voicemail. So when I checked the voicemail, she said that she'd been doing some thinking and that she had figured out that there was a demon in me making me feel the way that I felt, and that we had to find somebody to go pray real hard to so the demon would leave me and I'd get back to understanding who God truly wanted me to be. I didn't even bother calling her back. Sometimes trans folks find that the people in their lives feel differently about the reality of you being trans than they do about the idea of you being trans. When you tell them who you are, they're 100% on board. When it comes time to change behavior is when the problems start. My name is Callie now. My pronouns are she, her now. The real problems with my grandma started when I asked that of her. She said she just didn't know if she could do it. She didn't even want to try. One night in particular, she began to lecture me about a life situation that I was in. She repeated back to me what I had told her about my transition being a thing that would make me happier, and she observed that I didn't seem happier. When I was desperate to leave the job I was at the time, I started applying anywhere I thought would hire me. I applied to like a dozen crappy minimum wage retail jobs, and she lectured me that I'd never be able to pay for all the surgery that I wanted if I was working in a place like that. She didn't get that I was doing this because I was so miserable I wanted to kill myself. I wasn't able to be Callie at the job I worked at the time. It was torture. And so I lost control of myself. I stood in her kitchen screaming my throat out, crying harder than I ever cried in my life, trying to make her understand. And even though she was kind of being awful, I still, to this day, feel like an asshole for yelling at my grandma. And finally, she promised she would try. I guess, if it really means that much to you. And I realized at that point, if I had to scream and cry just to get her to try to respect me, I'm not sure I wanted to try anymore. And to her credit, she did try to continue to make the effort. She mostly got the name and pronouns right. She even bought me clothes and shoes sometimes. But after that night, things were just different. There wasn't a way to go back. Her God blinders wouldn't let her see her granddaughter for who she truly is. Her God blinders won't let her be happy when I hopefully eventually marry the woman I love. Her God blinders won't let her be happy if we adopt a kid and give her a grandchild. She'll continue to mourn the loss of her grandson and never celebrate the joy of her granddaughter living her life as a person she's always known herself to be. I can't handle it. I can't handle that kind of hurt over and over again. I haven't talked to my grandma in almost 2 years. It hurts. I miss laying in her bed as a kid, watching TV shows on Nick at Night. I miss having deep conversations about life. I miss my grandma. I'm not at peace with this, but I don't think there's anything left to do. She's in her late 80s. I don't think she's going to change her mind about what God thinks about me, and therefore what she thinks of me. I can only imagine that one day in the not too distant future, I'm going to get that call. The call that tells me that my grandma has died. And I have no idea how I'll feel. This is what religion does. At least my grandma kind of has an excuse. She has decades of religious programming to wade through. Atheists are supposed to have left that behind. I care about atheist activism because I know the harm that religion does to people. I know the lives it's destroyed. I know the hearts it's broken because one of them is mine. This is not an academic argument for me. We have to be better than questions like, what does any of this have to do with atheism? Thank you.
I posted to Twitter and Facebook after the talk was over that being real was the right decision. I still think it was. I needed about a half hour to decompress after the talk was over, but after that I felt pretty good about it. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. Definitely want to give a big thanks out to the organizers of NanoCon for having me out this year and for putting on an amazing event that I am super proud to have been a part of. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali. You can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto, make a per episode donation to help us out. If that's not something that's doable, you can always head over to iTunes, give us a 5-star review. That helps us rise in the rankings and get heard by more people. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.